Now that might just be my own naivety, but if I can underestimate that, then probably some other people can too. Now, just in case you don't know what I mean by the blue pill, this is a reference to the 1999 film The Matrix, and in the movie, in this science fiction film, the character Morpheus offers the character Neo / Thomas Anderson the choice of either taking the blue pill, which would keep him in this false world of the Matrix, or the red pill, which would lead to his escape from the illusion and his liberation into the real world. So this little bit of terminology represents a handy shortcut for describing people who choose the impure path of a contrived counterfeit reality, or the pure path of the astonishing authentic world. Most people who are interested in consciousness and self-development and spiritual truth and real experiences of real life would naturally state that they have chosen the red pill. But that isn't always the case. Secretly, in the background, quietly, they're still popping the blue pills. There is a serious diving off the cliff into the unknown for anyone who genuinely takes the red pill and chooses the real organic world over the distorted construct beamed into people's heads by the old hierarchy. Big questions about government, physics, society, law, psychology, the military-industrial complex, mystical knowledge, schemes to keep men dim-witted, bizarre covert think tanks that prescribe global cultural trends, the puppet show of politics, the psychic faculties of the human mind, big philosophical questions about birth, death, and purpose. The entire reflection of what is here in our world, why, and what is our place in it. That's the diving off the cliff of the red pill. Do you want to not only approach that stuff, but embrace it and make it part of your lived daily life? And unless all of these things have been deeply contemplated, unless they have been ruminated over, experienced, grappled with, dreamt of, desired, and determined, then that human mind that has not taken it upon itself to do those things is absolutely caught in the net of a fake world. That is the default position for those who choose not to grasp the nettle of reality. They drift in a simulation. They live not in a world, but in a mental construct that is a miserable imitation of the real thing. The real thing is big, magnificent, and frighteningly wonderful. But to get to it, to make meaningful contact with it, you have to let go of the fake world. And most people are not willing, prepared, or able to do that. They play around with it, sure. They pretend to let go, but they are actually still holding firmly onto it. Whilst there is a single piece of faulty thinking about any foundational concepts of government, society, culture, politics, whatever, all those things, whilst there is a single element of investment in those illusions, then the mind is lost. Every thought and perception is compromised as soon as it arises. No discussion with such minds is worthwhile. Those who choose illusion cannot, by definition, perceive the real world or any of the dynamics and components that constitute it. And naturally, those who choose illusion are not always aware that they have done so. You know, in their deepest, most truthful inner core, they are conscious of it. But that is buried deep. In normal conversation and thinking, it is not referenced. It's not relevant. This selection of the illusion does not exist. They aren't doing anything. They're just living in the world like everyone else. What's the problem? What are you talking about? Here I am. I'm doing stuff in the world. What illusion, crazy man? If you don't think freely and truly for yourself, if you don't claim your power and sovereignty to determine for yourself what the real world is, then you consent to live in a forgery. And in that forgery, which as I say is a mental construct, an unreality signal, Any discussion of guns is a waste of time. Any discussion of politics is meaningless. Any discussion of any substantial subject is dishonest and hollow. So, this is a divisive thing, is it not? But that doesn't necessarily mean, even when we do observe these things and do detect these minds that are not free, that are consenting to deceit, there's still no judgment involved. There's no value judgment required, not at all. Everyone is on a sacred journey learning about themselves, the universe, and the relationship between the two. If they choose to do that very slowly, and in fact keep postponing and abandoning this project to hide instead in the coarse materiality of the third density Earth realm, then that's fine, no problem. Go for it. From a higher level of no self and no qualitative difference between what we might call one human soul and another, there is no crime here. There's nothing wrong. We're just observing people caught up in the net. It's frustrating when those people have a bullhorn, have a mouthpiece, have a platform for being very vociferous and indignant. It's very frustrating to see that when, God help us, our instinct is shut the fuck up. It's frustrating, hard to deny that. But there's still nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with that choice. And I've often said that the worst thing that a human can do is to drift. To just drift into whatever comes along, good or bad, pleasing or rancid, blissful or painful. And that is what happens to people who disavow their will and the gift of their unique experience as a sovereign spirit on this planet. They forfeit their right to self-determination. They bob around in the river, floating around like a little twig, sometimes this way, sometimes that way, hitting rocks, sometimes plain sailing, sometimes being smashed and torn apart. This is living without exercising the will. This is how it looks when people do not take responsibility for their own consciousness. So considering that with these people, can we expect a good answer to this question? Is it a good idea to make sure that good, honourable men and women are able to bear arms to protect against oppressive and tyrannical government? Can illusion-dwelling minds feasibly provide any sort of intelligent answer to this when they have already indicated their unwillingness to take ownership of their own conscious experience of reality? I know in my bones that those people cannot sensibly answer important questions because they're not in a position to. You see, I told you this was checking in with Shadow, didn't I? About 8 years ago, I began writing for my blog, The Cleaver, because I wanted to create a clear and truthful platform in the best way that I knew how to combat the disgraceful lies of the UK government, which were reaching a crescendo of crookedness around 2005-2006. And this was during the Tony Blair government, the Labour Party, from 1997 to 2007 they held power. The Labour Party is the equivalent in the US of the Democratic Party. Also, around that time, I noticed that a lot of naive people were finally roused into some semblance of awareness when they saw Tony Blair reverently supporting the imperial right-wing administration of George W. Bush. Very blatantly, between the whole period between 2001 to 2005. During that time, a number of very prominent political cartoonists in England habitually drew Tony Blair with blood dripping from his hands. And this was in cartoons directly commentating on the fake war on terror and the deceptive Iraq business, but also in domestic political situations that had nothing to do with the war. Blair was still shown with these red, stained hands. And even these guys were sending previously ignorant left-wing voters the message that their leader was a dishonourable man and was not left-wing. And in fact, the whole paradigm of left-wing and right-wing of socialism and capitalism was coming to an end. There were not two opposing sides anymore.
There are some people who talk and some people who don't, which means that there are some people who leave this place and some who do not leave. You are obviously staying.
Has it ever occurred to you that you're just as much a prisoner as I am?
Oh, my dear chap, of course, I know too much. We're both lifers. I am definitely an optimist. That's why it doesn't matter who number one is. It doesn't matter which side runs the village.
It's run by one side or the other.
Oh, certainly. But both sides are becoming identical. What, in fact, has been created? An international community. A perfect blueprint for world order. When the sides facing each other suddenly realize that they're looking into a mirror, they will see that this is the pattern for the future.
The whole Earth, as the village. Yes.
That is my hope. What's yours?
I'd like to be the first man on the moon.
Well, must go. Delightful chat. Thank you, number 6.
And some of these cartoonists worked for left-leaning newspapers like The Guardian, which is a good quality newspaper, still is. In some ways, they were channeling the disillusionment of millions of Britons for the total abandonment of Labour Party principles. And this venal cabal of Alistair Campbell, Peter Mandelson and Tony Blair, these individuals totally crushed the last vestiges of the uncodified British Constitution and effectively did away with anybody's written rights for anything at all. Freedom of speech, right to process radically reduced and continue to shrink, and the flabby interpretation of what it means to plot terrorism, where any sort of subversive thoughts and deeds could be punished without any obstacle of law. People were and continue to be just lifted off the streets. Not just funny brown people with funny clothes that don't look like lovely white English people, but anyone. Red, white, brown, green, purple, English, Arabic, Muslim, Christian, anybody involved. Anyone who's subversive enough was lifted, taken away. Bye-bye. So in the thick of this, I noticed that the government were determined to remove weapons from the population as fast as possible. Now, England had already been essentially disarmed, which we'll come to in a moment, but they were targeting knives and any potentially offensive weapon. Any sort of knife violence was pulled right to the top of the national news every single night. If the government had the people's best interests at heart, taking weapons out of circulation might represent, explicable and very prudent thinking, of course. But when you realise that the government couldn't care less about the people, you realise, as is codified into the US Constitution, that guns are also to protect people against government. But polite British people don't like to talk about such things. It's all very upsetting and demoralising, that kind of thing. Not to brilliant, awesome, conscious British people who know better, but to mainstream dumbasses. They would rather not think about such things and hold this image that Britain is peaceful and wonderful and progressive. So that's why I started the Cleaver, to go into all this lot and say, hang on a second, there's something very, very wrong here. And nobody's talking about this in the way that I would like to hear about it. So rather than just sit on my arse and moan, let me try and do something about it with my little tiny voice. Let me try and say things. Let me try and make that voice a little bit bigger. So one way of doing that was to sort of remind people just how quickly guns get removed from the map of social consciousness. And there's some bits here from my essay of June 2006, Disarming the People. In Britain, it began with the Pistols Act of 1903, and this seemingly rational law established that handgun sales could only be made to those who had a licence. Now again, in a sane and moral society governed with integrity by men and women of honour, this would be cool, right? Of course it would. It would be common sense. But unfortunately, we're a long way from that. And so in the meantime, it is wise to keep weapons so people who do have honour, who do embody honour in their daily life, and balance, and civility, and wisdom, the good guys, in other words, right? they can make sure that things don't go totally south.